If you are overweight, obese, pre-diabetic, or have type 2 diabetes, this protocol is for you. Only 12.2% of American adults are now metabolically healthy. 86 million adults in the US have pre-diabetes, and 70% of these individuals will eventually develop diabetes. Being overweight or obese is the main factor for progression to diabetes. The best way to reverse diabetes is to not get diabetes in the first place, because your chances of heart disease, cancer, and death are increased even as a pre-diabetic. Our protocol offers real hope and transformational change to patients who would otherwise be consigned to a lifetime of medications, doctor's visits, and suffering. Welcome to ReverseDiabetes.md.
Hi, I'm Dr. Gurpreet Pata. I'm a board-certified anesthesiologist, interventional pain physician, and addiction specialist. Today I'll be talking a little bit about one of our protocols that we utilize to help patients with obesity, prediabetes, and diabetes type 2. The main thing with obesity, prediabetes, and diabetes type 2 is that it really is the crux or the core of most of our modern diseases. Most of our cerebrovascular accidents, most of the strokes, the cancers, the Alzheimer's disease, the cardiovascular risks that we have are all metabolic dysfunctions, and they're related to malnutrition. Normally we think of malnutrition that we don't get enough of something. In this particular case, it's the malnutrition of overconsumption, which leads to severe metabolic inflammation, something we call meta-inflammation. The best thing to do with diabetes is to not get diabetes in the first place. If you already are pre-diabetic, your risk of cardiovascular disease, cancer, and death are already increasing. So the key element in diabetes, in reversing it, is to never get it in the first place. So most of my patients that come in to me already have obesity. They already are pre-diabetic, and many of them don't realize that they're diabetic. Our protocols that we utilize offer real hope and transformational change to our patients. Otherwise, these patients would be consigned to a lifetime of medications, doctor's visits, and suffering. Our hope is to make a massive change in their lives so that we give them the tools to help them move forward. The root cause of diabetes type 2 is obesity and prediabetes. It's metabolic inflammation. If you have a combination of sugar, vegetable oil, and grains, you end up with diabetes. You get to diabetes through obesity and prediabetes. Some people say that obesity is now at an epidemic proportion. I would say that obesity is a pandemic. An epidemic is when one thing spreads to another thing in the same species. In our particular case, we have a pandemic. A pandemic is when it goes across species lines. Every single species that eats the same food from a westernized culture gets diabetes. They get obesity. They get metabolic syndrome. They get early onset cognitive declines, and they get cancers. So it's a pandemic, and it's not related to the particular species. It's related to the food. At this point, the year 2019, only 12.2% of the adult population is still healthy. These are data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey from 2009 to 2016. And that survey shows that only about 1 in 8 adults has no chronic disease and are metabolically healthy and don't require medication. That means the vast majority, 82% of the population in the United States, is metabolically unhealthy. Almost all of the patients that come to our clinic are overweight. And when we actually look at their biometrics, when we look at their blood testing, when we look at their physical morphometrics, when we discuss with them their histories and their physicals, they all either have prediabetes or they have severe metabolic inflammation, which is really prediabetes. Prediabetes is the condition that precedes type 2 diabetes. There are changes in the immune cells. There are changes in the number of immune cells and how they function. which cause these cells to migrate toward inflammation. And if there's already inflammation there from an injury or something else, it makes that injury and symptom 10 times worse. There's an upregulation of cytokines, and this immune activation begins during the pre-diabetic state. You don't have to wait to be diabetic to have this severe inflammatory response. Our goal is to treat early because we want to generate real results for our patients. Hopper et al. Did a very nice study on the prevention of diabetes and reduction in major cardiovascular events, and they did a large meta-analysis, and they found that even below the threshold, the diagnostic cutoff of hemoglobin A1C of 6.5, below that threshold, all the way down to 5.6, there was a increased risk of adverse cardiovascular outcome, and it could approach a few 100% difference between having normal blood glucoses and normal insulin responses and being a pre-diabetic versus being a diabetic. So you've already started to establish macrovascular change at a normal range of pre-diabetes, and by the time that you become diabetic with a hemoglobin A1C greater than 6.5, you've already got a base of severe injury, and now you're going to have progression of microvascular changes. The unfortunate part about this is that most providers don't recognize this. Most providers don't realize that the patient is at an extraordinarily increased risk of significant inflammation and metabolic dysfunction, which can lead to severe cardiovascular compromise, even in this pre-diabetic state. Most providers also rely on information that they received in medical school, or they rely on information that's transmitted to them through the lay press, or they rely on information that's given to them through typically drug-sponsored meetings or through pharmaceutical reps. And this creates some difficulty. In fact, in a global survey done by Credit Suisse, which is a large international banking firm that also happens to be an insurance firm that looks at the causes of death and tries to figure out how to prolong people's lives because they essentially insure life insurance, they figured out that about 92% of physicians thought that eating fat led to cardiovascular disease, when we know that this is not true. They said that 87% thought that eating fat led to obesity, and we know this is not true. More than half of the physicians thought that the cholesterol that was in the food led to increased cholesterol in the blood, and it's simply not true. 80% plus of physicians thought that eating butter was far worse than eating margarine. Nearly 2/3 of physicians thought that vegetable oil was actually healthy. This study was done in 2015. This is recent. We've had a lot of changes in our medical knowledge since some of the original dietary guidelines came about in 1977. And even then they were wrong. So, it makes one pause and wonder how long does it take for new information to proliferate. Prescription medication is now the third most common cause of death globally. It's one of the most common causes of death, right behind heart disease and cancer. The over-prescribing of medication to patients is a major, major, major problem. And we need to learn how to de-prescribe as much as we learn how to prescribe. And most physicians fundamentally have never been taught how to de-prescribe. And in the treatment of patients with type 2 diabetes, because we've been treating the wrong thing for such a long time, de-prescribing is as valuable as prescribing. The root cause of obesity, prediabetes, and type 2 diabetes is embedded in the food environment and the human's interaction with that food environment. The burden of diet-related diseases contributes to more disease and death globally than physical inactivity, smoking, and alcohol combined. In fact, it's probably the most single expensive cost of disease in the entire world. What we eat determines how our bodies function, and a poor dietary pattern single-handedly determines cardiovascular risk. Single-handedly probably determines the vast majority of chronic disease. One of the major issues is the 1977 Dietary Guidelines, which really came out in 1980, were fundamentally flawed science. And because of the fundamental flaw in science, the recommendation came out to increase carbohydrate consumption and shift away from natural food that contain animal products and fats. And when you shift away from foods containing animal products and fats, it leaves a big hole in your total calorie per day. And at the end of the day, it creates a situation where you know that 9 calories per gram comes out of fat and 4 calories per gram comes out of carbohydrate. And if you're trying to reduce the animal fat, you have to replace it with something to get your macronutrients, and people ended up increasing the amount of carbohydrate consumption. So marching orders were given to Big Food through the U.S. Department of Agriculture to promote the utilization of subsidized products. And with those marching orders, there was a request to come up with low-fat foods. And literally overnight, the spread of low-fat food and the utilization of low-fat as the mantra for losing weight became entrenched in the culture. The issue with nutritional epidemiology, which is how most of these studies are done, is that it's a farce. Nutritional epidemiology depends not on necessarily randomized controlled trials. It depends on patient recollection. And most of the nutritional epidemiology studies rely on patient recollection years ago with food questionnaires. Now, there are ways to make food questionnaires reliable, but most of the existing studies that we rely on to come up with the dietary guidelines are deeply flawed. And so a deeply flawed study results in a deeply flawed guideline. The other problem is that the food industry, like it's supposed to do in order to generate product and in order to generate profit, it convinces officials, it convinces scientists, it convinces politicians, and it convinces the public that their food is good because it wants to sell more of it and it wants to sell as much as it can. And that motivation is a very significant factor in the obesity epidemic, which then leads to obviously prediabetes and diabetes. Max Planck probably said it correctly. Science progresses one funeral at a time. When tobacco was first recognized as having a link between smoking and lung cancer, it took nearly 50 years before people formally recognized that, and there were political changes made, and there was punitive measures for big tobacco to pay for its downstream expenses, because the cost of tobacco is relatively low. And the only way to force tobacco to recognize that it was creating a defective product was to make it responsible for its downstream expenses. And in food, that's coming. The food industry has, as I stated, a fiduciary duty. People say that low carbohydrate, high fat is a fad, that eating low sugar and high fat is something that's made up. And that's simply not true. There's actually probably about 30 randomized controlled trials, far greater than for the low-fat, high-carbohydrate trials, suggesting that low-carbohydrate, high-fat dietary intake is extraordinarily safe, that it's probably superior for weight loss and for cardiovascular disease reduction. The real issue is that low-fat, high-carbohydrate, which is the dietary guideline, is probably a myth. The Women's Health Initiative looked at about 48,000 postmenopausal women with a follow-up of about 8 years. They had postulated that a low-fat, calorie-reduced diet, reducing calories by about 300 calories per day, would maintain significant weight loss and would reduce cardiovascular risk. Even though these people had a reduced caloric intake, they did not produce any significant weight loss over the duration of the study. And the hypothesis that low fat was beneficial for cardiovascular disease was proven to be false. So there's nothing magical about fat. Fat is just that. It's fat. It's a 9 calorie per gram consumption. There are certainly certain essential fats that our body can't produce. But the real issue with fat consumption is that good, healthy fats produce tremendous satiation. And they produce more satiation when compared to other macronutrients like proteins and carbohydrates. And comparatively, they have very low effect on insulin production. Carbohydrates have a dramatic high effect on insulin production. And remember, insulin is the fat storage hormone. So if you eat sugar, you dump insulin. Insulin causes fat storage. If you eat fat, your insulin doesn't move. You burn fat. You don't get to store fat. The fat that you eat usually gets consumed in energy. The sugar that you eat usually becomes part of the fat that's stored in your liver. It really is about the kind of fat. So it's not just any fat, but it has to be a safe fat that is either saturated fat, where all the carbons are occupied, or it has to be a particular kind of polyunsaturated fat, such as an omega-3 that's not rancid, that's safe. The issue is that when we look at studies, it's the kind of fat that's safe or unsafe. Real food has real saturated fat. Industrial seed oil, which is vegetable oil, is not real food. It has a bunch of linoleic acid in it. And unfortunately, linoleic acid oxidizes with light, with heat, and simply processing and storage. We found that saturated fat, healthy real fat from real animals or real butter or from coconut, does not increase all-cause mortality, does not increase cardiovascular risk, does not lead to ischemic stroke, and is not associated with type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome. Saturated fat is the historical part of our ancestral diet. We've had saturated fat in our diet for millions of years. The polyunsaturated fat of vegetable oil really came about in about 1917. And that's when it really shows a major appearance in the consumption patterns of Americans. And then it really bumps up again in the late 70s with the promulgation of some of the dietary guidelines. Real fat from real food does not make you fat. In fact, there's a couple studies out that show that full-fat dairy actually protects patients against obesity. Processed seed oils, which is vegetable oil, is industrially produced. It goes through a series of steps to essentially create a compound that you wouldn't normally see in nature. It creates a polyunsaturated fatty acid that is extremely unstable and rapidly oxidizes. That rapid oxidation of linoleic acid, when consumed, leads to an oxidation of LDL in the human body, which causes significant formation of inflammatory cells. In fact, there's some interesting studies out that show that you can't make macrophages, the inflammatory cells in your body, react to just any polyunsaturated fatty acid. You have to have oxidized linoleic acid to create foam cells out of macrophages. So it requires a little bit of finagling. And we just happen to have created the exact right milieu of stuff to make these things oxidize. When I talk to patients, I tell them to eat like their great-grandmother. I want them to eat as much natural, whole food that's not processed and not refined. Refining seriously increases the glycemic index of food. It increases the absorption of food and increases its inflammatory status. And it also just dumps a bunch of sugar into their system. And it makes the absorption of the food much more rapid than what would be expected. So our goal always is to have people eat like their great-grandmother, which is closer to what Paleolithic times were, or at least early agrarian times. The key thing to remember is that the initial guidelines, the initial dietary guidelines in 1977, essentially demonized saturated fat, and it pushed patients away from the wholesome, regular, good food toward processed foods that were easily shelf-stable and could be manufactured and sold by big food companies. Our protocols essentially push patients to eat saturated fat that reduces their desire to eat again shortly. It increases their satiety. And we know that dietary saturated fats, decreasing them does not reduce the cardiovascular risk effects. So, and we also know that increasing them, if you have the right fat, can actually be quite beneficial. So our recommendations are a higher fat, low carbohydrate diet, as long as the fat is a healthy fat. You know, it's interesting, if you do look at some of the studies, which is why some of these vegetable oils have a heart-healthy label. The heart-healthy label says that if you consume this vegetable oil, such as a safflower oil or corn oil or one of these other oils, that it's heart-healthy because it lowers LDL cholesterol. But the problem is that it lowers it and it doesn't actually reduce cardiovascular mortality. And in fact, some studies show that a lowered LDL, especially in 70 and 80-year-olds, can actually increase stroke rates and increase heart attack rates compared to people with comparing low levels versus high levels. And you're actually protective by having a higher LDL. So it's really not necessarily the LDL that's causing the heart disease. It's probably the insulin resistance. If you look at the studies, it shows that total and LDL cholesterol are very poor markers of cardiovascular health. What's a better marker is a high triglyceride level and a low HDL. That's a much better predictive factor. Other things that are worthwhile are HOMO-IR, insulin resistance markers. If we actually prevented insulin resistance in young men, we could probably prevent about 40% of all myocardial infarctions. We could probably reduce hypertension in about 30% of these patients. That's a pretty significant factor. About refined carbohydrates. Prediabetes and type 2 diabetes are diseases of insulin resistance with excessive insulin production. And the symptom of that excessive insulin, the symptom of the excessive glucose is a symptom rather than the disease. So when we talk about diabetes, most people say, well, diabetes is because I have too much glucose in my system. And I would contend that you have too much glucose in your system because you have insulin resistance, and the too much glucose in your system is a symptom of the disease rather than the disease itself. Our goal in our clinic is to treat the cause of the disease instead of the symptom. We want to eliminate all refined carbohydrates to reverse obesity, prediabetes, and type 2 diabetes. That doesn't mean that you can't have carbohydrates. We just want to eliminate the refined ones so we can minimize their glycemic index. Refined carbohydrates are known to increase blood glucose levels, and if you increase blood glucose levels, we know that that's going to increase your medication requirements, and we know that that's going to increase your weight gain. It's disturbing to me that the dietary guidelines, even for diabetics, continue to recommend nearly 55% of their macronutrient consumption be carbohydrates, which is the exact problem causing their disease. Their disease is getting worse because of the sugar, and we're using medications to reduce the sugar in their bloodstream, which are making their disease get worse because it's storing more fat in their liver, making them more insulin resistant and making their metabolic inflammation worse. The symptom that we're seeing is obviously the sugar in their blood, but the disease is the insulin resistance. In fact, there's a couple of studies out that show that there is absolutely no requirement for dietary consumption of sugar whatsoever. And sugar added to your diet has no real nutritional value. There's no vitamins in it. There's nothing as in terms of microelement that you're going to get out of it. There's no minerals that are of any significant value. Our recommendation is to reduce consumed sugars. We want to do as much as we can to reduce consumed sugars, to get the greatest fall in hemoglobin A1C, and to have the best benefit to reversing diabetes. Again, it's a combination of sugar, vegetable oil, and grain that leads to obesity, prediabetes, and type 2 diabetes. The reason why grain is in there is because grain changes the gut permeability and allows inflammatory material from the intestine to get into the bloodstream and cause a dramatic increase in metabolic inflammation. And most of that material initially goes to the liver and is detoxified in the liver, which is already in an inflamed state from ectopic lipid formation from too high of an insulin level. Dietary sugar is strongly associated with increasing risk of type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, independent of its calorie or its effect on body weight. So these are all effects outside of just the fact that you're getting bigger. These are direct inflammatory changes. So people talk about vegetable oil and they say it's vegetable oil, but there's no vegetables in there. This is industrially processed synthetic seed oil. It's been processed to the point where it's unrecognizable. The history of industrial seed oils started with initially the cotton gin and the mass production of cotton seed. You would get about 160 pounds of cotton per 100 pounds of processed linen. Unfortunately, you couldn't do anything with the cottonseed, and most people would leave it to rot in the fields, or they would throw it illegally into streams. Eventually, people got smart and tried to figure out if they could use it for home house lighting. They figured out a way to deodorize it because it stenched so bad because it rapidly oxidized. And once they figured out how to deodorize it, they started to add it as a supplement to basically food for animals. And they noticed immediately that it made animals super, super fat. And that's really the origin of how it was introduced into the food stream. And eventually, Procter & Gamble in about 1915, 1917, started producing Crisco, which is crystallized cottonseed oil. And they started to produce that as a shortening and convinced the American housewives that this was a safer, better use of their kitchen time, and it would bring them into the modern age. The thing with all of these vegetable oils is that they appear shelf stable even though they're rancid. You can't tell when a polyunsaturated fatty acid omega-6 is rancid because it just tastes the same. But if you had a polyunsaturated fatty acid omega-3, which comes from fish, and it became rancid, you wouldn't even want to be in the same room. It stenches so bad. So typically when you have a PUFA omega-3, you're never going to eat it. But a PUFA omega-6, which is industrial seed oil or vegetable oil, people eat those all the time. So even though they appear shelf stable, they're oxidized linoleic acid. Oxidized linoleic acid has only really been used since about 1917. And before that, it was really considered a industrial waste product. And couldn't really get rid of it, and you really wouldn't even want to feed it to animals because it would increase the risk of cancer. There's been a lot of meta-analysis on polyunsaturated fatty acids that are omega-6s, and definitely confirms that there's an increased risk of death and cardiovascular disease related with this. And so this has been a significant concern. So these aren't really heart healthy as we thought. The original data to make people think that these were heart healthy was when they included omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids in the intake. And that's how the anti-coronary club trial got people to believe that omega-6s were better. You have to realize that cancer is probably a metabolic disease. And one of the primary metabolism defects with cancer is its interaction with omega-6 vegetable oil. In rat studies, you really can't even get animals to get cancer, especially rats, unless you pre-treat them with omega-6 fatty acids. You have to pre-treat them because if you don't, they won't get cancer. Eating less to lose weight. So the big food industry has decided to push back, and they've said, you know what, if Americans just ate less, or maybe if they exercised more, maybe they wouldn't be so fat. So they're basically victim blaming. And the reality is that they focus in on the calorie. And there's, on the back of every package, there's a calorie label. But the problem is a calorie is only a calorie if you're incinerating it in a bomb calorimeter and measuring the heat. The problem is biologically derived calories are highly dependent upon a lot of other factors. They're completely dependent upon your hormonal system, your insulin response system, your cholecystokinin, your peptide YY. It's dependent upon what else you've eaten. It's dependent upon time of day. It depends upon your food frequency. It depends on how much insulin you've released and what your pre-existing metabolic state is. If you take all of your calories and you confine them to a short insulin burst for the whole day, you get a much different response than if you graze all day and you constantly release insulin all the time. So there are a lot of other factors, and so the word calorie is a calorie is true if you have a bomb calorimeter, but it's probably not true for the average human being. Our current caloric reduction strategies, low-calorie foods, to promote weight loss are incredibly ineffective. In a couple studies they've done, less than 1 in 167 patients who use a low-calorie approach actually maintain weight loss. And that means that 99% plus of patients who try this approach do not lose weight. So obesity is a symptom of nutrient accumulation. It's an accumulation of nutrients in a place that they're not supposed to be. It's assumed that excessive calorie intake is the root cause of obesity. But the problem is a calorie of food energy can have a lot of different metabolic fates depending upon the hormonal situation. A calorie in the presence of insulin that's a carbohydrate gets stored as a fat. And the thing is that fats don't release insulin, so fats get consumed. And even though fats have more calorie density versus carbohydrates, the carbohydrate is more likely to make you fat than the fat is. If you focus in on calories in and calories out, you get an inherent bias against fat foods. And just literally using the word fat foods makes patients think that they're going to get fat eating it, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. What we want patients to do is focus in on the quality of the food rather than the quantity. We want them to focus in on satiety and being full and being in a good place. And the weight loss will come just as you reduce your insulin, and you'll hardly notice it, and you'll be satiated. We don't want patients to yo-yo, because every time they yo-yo, every time they weight cycle, some of those progenitor fat cells change, and the insulin resistance seems to get worse, and the dyslipidemia seems to get worse, and they have more fat stem cells that get generated every time they yo-yo, and so there's more weight gain every time they go up and down. Food industry says that low carb plus exercise will cause improved health. We already have shown that low carbohydrate consumption does not benefit you And there's actually been a study that shows that low carbohydrate plus exercise does not increase cardiovascular benefit. And in fact, it does not lower the rate of type 2 diabetes. So despite the significant weight loss that occurred, which was about 13 and a half years, there wasn't really a significant health benefit. So low carb doesn't seem to make you lose weight long term. Low carb plus exercise makes you lose weight, but you don't get a reduction in cardiovascular outcome. Moving more is not necessarily the solution. The food industry sponsors organizations to increase patient perception of health through sports sponsorships, but further physical activity doesn't seem to make a huge amount of difference whatsoever. Exercise does help health, but just not weight reduction. It's really the amount of time spent not eating that's key. The decrease in fat frequency will decrease your global insulin release, and that will prevent obesity. It's that combination of sugar, vegetable oil, and grain that's the problem.
This has been Dr. Pata with ReverseDiabetes.md. Remember, the information discussed should not be considered specific medical advice and does not constitute a physician-patient relationship. This field is extremely complex and requires a direct physician and patient interaction. Each patient is medically unique and the exact protocol will need to be tailored. If you need further assistance, call our office at 314-481-5000 or send us an email to info@reversediabetes.md.